Unit 1. Laws of the Land. Chapter 1. The Foundations of Government. Getting started. Previewing the topic. Page 5.
Hey, did you ever take a close look at the back of a $1 bill?
No, not really. Is there something special about it?
Well, yeah. See, it has some really interesting symbols on it.
Let me see. The two circles. Aren't they the two sides of the Great Seal?
That's right. And see the pyramid in the circle on the left? It means that America has a strong foundation. And look on the bottom. You see the number 1776 in Roman numerals? That's the year the United States became an independent country. And there are some symbols in the other circle, too.
Let me get a closer look. There's a bird.
Yeah, that's the bald eagle. It's the national symbol of the United States.
And some writing in Latin.
E pluribus unum. That means, out of many, one. It means that the United States is made up of many states and many people, but it's still one nation. See?
Yeah, sure. What about the stars above the eagle's head? What do they mean?
They're symbols for the original 13 states. And see, there are other groups of 13 in the Great Seal, too. Like the pyramid has 13 steps.
Wow! I had no idea a $1 bill was so full of meaning.
I know, it's really interesting. Now I'm going to try to find out what some of the other symbols mean.
Interview 1. Reasons for voting or not voting. Listening for different ways of saying yes and no. Page 8.
I'd like to ask all of you some questions about voting. Manuel, you first. Do you vote?
Well, not usually. I mean, I know it's important, but I'm always too busy on Election Day. I can never seem to get to the polls.
Why is that? The polls are open from 6 in the morning until 9 at night.
Yes, but it's still not convenient for a lot of people. I didn't vote for president while I was in college because I had too much to do. Then the next election, I had a really crazy day and I just couldn't make it. I don't really understand how in this great democracy people have to work on Election Day. I think we should get a national holiday, like they do in a lot of other countries, so that we can vote.
A national holiday for voting? That's an interesting suggestion. Now, what about you, Mary? Do you vote?
Sure. I think it's really important for citizens to vote. You know, voting gives you a voice, a feeling that you have the power to make a difference. When you vote, you get to say who you feel is the best candidate, who can help more in dealing with the country's problems.
And do you believe your vote can really make a difference?
Absolutely. I mean, if millions of people vote for what they believe, they have a lot of power. I disagree with Manuel. If people really want to vote, they can find time on Election Day to do it.
Kelly, what about you? Do you agree with Mary that voting is important?
Yeah, I do. Frankly, I can't understand people who don't bother to vote. I think voting is a civic duty and it should be compulsory. That's what happens in other countries around the world. I read that in 34 countries, voting is an obligation. It's required by law.
So do you vote yourself?
Of course I do. I voted as soon as I turned 18. And lots of people feel the same way as I do. Take a look at the last election. Young people are coming out to vote. And that is making all the difference.
And you, Ralph, do you vote?
Nah, I haven't recently. What's the point? I feel like even if I do vote, nothing ever changes. It doesn't seem to make any difference who's in power. Actually, I don't trust most politicians. When they run for office, they make a lot of promises, but then they don't keep any of them.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 9. Excerpt 1.
Well, not usually. I mean, I know it's important, but I'm always too busy on election day. I can never seem to get to the polls.
Excerpt 2.
Sure. I think it's really important for citizens to vote. You know, voting gives you a voice, a feeling that you have the power to make a difference.
Excerpt 3.
Of course I do. I voted as soon as I turned 18. And lots of people feel the same way as I do.
Excerpt 4.
Nah, I haven't recently. What's the point?
Interview 2. Voter turnout. Listening for main ideas. Page 10.
Hi, Robert. Do you think that voting is important?
Yes, I do. And I think voting is becoming increasingly important. You notice in the news that more and more people are voting these days, especially young people.
Why do you think more people are voting nowadays?
Well, I think it's because people are more aware of the issues today. Let's face it, there are many problems that need to be addressed.
What problems are people concerned about?
Well, they're worried about things that affect them personally. And they're also concerned about world events.
What's the most important issue, in your opinion?
Well, the environment is definitely a critical topic. Scientists have proved that global warming is a huge problem, and we can't go on ignoring it. Already we see that sea levels are rising, and the problem is just going to get worse unless we take decisive steps to address it.
Are there any other issues that concern you?
Well, the economy, for one. The government needs to do something about all the people that are out of work. I mean, I understand there's a global economic crisis, but surely we have to make it a priority to get people back to work. So for me, that's the number one issue. And then there's the issue of healthcare.
Healthcare?
Yes, healthcare is a big problem because it's so expensive to see a doctor or get an operation. But I think it's a basic right of every citizen to have adequate medical coverage.
How is voting going to help resolve these issues?
Well, the political parties are sharply divided over these issues. And if we vote for the representatives we agree with, we can put them in power.
Lecture. Nelson Rogers. The structure of the U.S. federal government. Before the lecture. Listening for the plan of a lecture. Page 14.
Hi, welcome to you all. My name is Nelson Rogers. I'm here to represent Ed Sullivan, who was an elected official in New York State for many years. Before that, he also taught English for about 15 years, and he loves to teach students about the U.S. government. He sends you his greetings. You know, whenever I speak to students, I always get a lot of questions about the basic structure of the federal government. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of how the government is organized, and that way you can start to understand how it works. First, I'll introduce the three branches of government. I'll be using this chart here on the board to help you understand. And then after that, I'll explain the system of checks and balances.
Lecture. Part 1. The three branches of the U.S. federal government. Using information the lecturer puts on the board. Page 17.
Hi, welcome to you all. My name is Nelson Rogers. I'm here to represent Ed Sullivan, who was an elected official in New York State for many years. Before that, he also taught English for about 15 years, and he loves to teach students about the U.S. government. He sends you his greetings. You know, whenever I speak to students, I always get a lot of questions about the basic structure of the federal government. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of how the government is organized, and that way you can start to understand how it works. First, I'll introduce the three branches of government. I'll be using this chart here on the board to help you understand. And then after that, I'll explain the system of checks and balances. All right, now as you can see on the board, the US government has three branches, or parts, called the legislative, executive, and judicial. So let me start with the legislative branch, which makes the laws. So here on the left, where it says responsibility, I'm writing makes laws. I'll just fill in this box for you as an example. Okay. In the US, the legislative branch of government is called Congress. And Congress actually has two parts, or houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Members of the Senate are called senators, and members of the House are called representatives. Have you got that? Okay. Good. So now, let me give you a few more details about Congress. Each state has 2 senators. And since there are 50 states, there are exactly 100 senators. On the other hand, the House of Representatives has 435 members. That's because the number of representatives from each state depends on the size of that state's population. Obviously, states with larger populations, like California, have more representatives. All right, the next branch of government I want to describe is the executive branch, which executes or approves the laws that Congress makes. And who has that job? The president. Actually, the president has many responsibilities, but the most important one is the power to approve laws. Now, besides the president, the executive branch also includes the vice president and the heads of government departments, who are called secretaries. You know, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, and so on. Finally, there's the judicial branch. Judicial is related to the word judge. Now, there are 3 levels of courts in the United States: city, state, and federal. But when we talk about the judicial branch of the federal government, we're usually talking about the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court has 9 members called justices, and their job is to interpret the laws passed by Congress. In other words, to decide if a law is constitutional or not.
Lecture, Part 2. The System of Checks and Balances. Taking Good Lecture Notes. Page 18.
Okay, now why do you think the federal government is divided this way? Well, the Founding Fathers, meaning the men who wrote the Constitution, wanted to avoid a dictatorship. They didn't want one person or one branch to have too much power. And to make sure this didn't happen, they invented a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances means that the 3 branches of government have separate responsibilities, but they also have the power to check or limit each other's actions. Let me give you some examples of how checks and balances work. The way Supreme Court justices are chosen is a good example. Supreme Court justices don't get elected. The president chooses them. But the Senate has the power to approve or disapprove of the president's choice. The Senate, in this case, can check the president's power to choose Supreme Court justices. Here's another example. Let's suppose Congress passes a law, but the president doesn't want to approve it. If that happens, the Constitution gives the president the power to veto it. In other words, he can decide not to sign it. And according to the Constitution, a law doesn't become a law until the president signs it. So in this case, the president is checking the power of Congress. Let me give you a third example. Suppose Congress passes a law and the president signs it. Is that the end of the process? Usually yes, but sometimes no. There are times when people challenge the constitutionality of a law. It can be a private citizen, or a corporation, or a city government who believes that the law is wrong or unfair because it goes against the Constitution. Most cases like that will be heard in a lower level court. But the Supreme Court has the final authority to decide if the law, which was passed by Congress and signed by the president, remember, is either constitutional or unconstitutional. So this is an example of the Supreme Court checking and balancing the other 2 branches. So I hope now that you have a basic understanding of the three branches of the U.S. government and how these branches control each other through a system of checks and balances.
Unit 1. Laws of the Land. Chapter 2. Constitutional Issues Today. Getting started. Understanding numbers, dates, and time expressions. Page 20. 1.
The United States declared its independence from Britain on July 4th, 1776.
2.
The Constitution was adopted in 1789.
3.
The Bill of Rights became part of the Constitution in 1791.
4.
The American Civil War took place from 1861 to 1865.
5.
The 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865.
6.
The 15th Amendment gave African American men the right to vote in 1870.
7.
From 1787 to 1920, only men had the right to vote.
8.
In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote.
9.
On July 1st, 1971, the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18.
Interview 1. Important constitutional rights. Listening for specific information. Page 24.
Hi, Magda. We're here to discuss constitutional rights. Are there any rights that are especially important to you?
Yes, freedom of speech. And of course, that includes the freedom to express yourself in words or in any other way, even if people don't agree with you.
What's your profession?
I'm a photographer. And in art, freedom of expression is critical. Art is a powerful way of expressing ideas, and that right must be protected, even if the ideas are controversial. I believe censorship is wrong. I don't think anyone has the right to tell people what they can see.
Does that ever happen?
Yeah, it happens all the time. For example, the government has always censored violent photographs during wartime. And sometimes works of art or works of literature are banned because someone considers them offensive.
Don't you agree with that?
No, of course not. Look, even if you personally disagree with the message of a work of literature or a piece of art, you have to allow people the freedom to express themselves. That's our constitutional right.
Well, now let me turn to you, Hang, and ask you the same question. Is there any constitutional right that's especially important for you?
Well, recently I've really come to value the fact that in the United States we have freedom of assembly. This includes the right to demonstrate and complain and demand change. The First Amendment gives us that right.
Did something happen to make you start thinking about this?
Yes, there was a big demonstration at my college. I'm a law student. The students wanted the university to stop buying products from companies that use child labor. See, a lot of university products, like hats and t-shirts, are made in countries that allow children to work in factories.
And what happened after the demonstration?
Well, the university changed its policy. So you see, our protests were very effective. This shows the importance of the right to meet up and express our ideas.
Interview 2. A controversial right. Listening for specific information. Page 25.
Gloria, let's turn to you now. Can you identify an important constitutional right?
Well, the right to bear arms is important to me. I know this is very controversial and a lot of people disagree with me, but I believe the Second Amendment gives us that right.
Why do people disagree with you?
Well, the words of the Second Amendment aren't exactly clear. Some people think it means that only the police or soldiers have the right to have guns, but I don't think that's right.
But if everyone has the right to own a gun, aren't you worried that some people will use them for the wrong reasons?
Well, yeah, of course, but look, there are two groups of people who own guns. One is criminals, and they will own guns anyway, whether it's legal or not. And the second group is responsible citizens who own guns for good reasons.
What are those reasons?
Well, some people have guns for sports, like hunting or target shooting, and others have guns for self-protection.
Self-protection. Do you think that's really necessary?
Yes. The police can't always protect people. They can't be everywhere at once, because that's obviously not possible. So store owners and homeowners in some areas might feel they need a gun to protect themselves. I agree with them.
Listening for stressed words. Page 26. Excerpt 1.
The words of the Second Amendment aren't exactly clear.
Excerpt 2.
Some people have guns for sports.
Excerpt 3.
The police can't always protect people.
Lecture. Marcella Benciveni. The First Amendment. Before the lecture. Listening for main ideas and details. Page 32. Excerpt 1.
What does it mean to have freedom of religion? Well, freedom of religion is a very important right. Basically, it means two things. First, Americans are free to practice their religion without interference from the government. And second, there is no national religion. Now, this freedom affects Americans in many ways. For instance, an employer can't hire you or fire you just because he likes or doesn't like your religion. And freedom of religion includes how you dress. What I mean is, Americans are free to wear any kind of religious clothing they prefer.
Excerpt 2.
All right, now the next freedom listed in the First Amendment is maybe the most famous one, because it's the one that all of us practice every single day, and that's freedom of speech. What does that mean exactly? Basically, it means you're free to talk openly about your ideas, even if other people disagree with them. You're also free to read or listen to other people's ideas. But in addition, freedom of speech includes what we call symbolic speech, like wearing the clothes you like. In fact, the courts have said that freedom of speech includes all forms of expression, meaning words, pictures, music, even the way you wear your hair.
Lecture. Part 1. Overview of the First Amendment. Using symbols and abbreviations. Page 33.
Today's lecture is about the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which for many Americans is probably the most important part of the Bill of Rights because it affects the way we live every day. I'll begin with an overview of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. And after that, in the second part of my talk, I'll tell you about some cases that will show you why the First Amendment is so controversial. So now the First Amendment guarantees American citizens 5 basic freedoms: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. What does it mean to have freedom of religion? Well, freedom of religion is a very important right. Basically, it means two things. First, Americans are free to practice their religion without interference from the government. And second, there is no national religion. Now, this freedom affects Americans in many ways. For instance, an employer can't hire you or fire you just because he likes or doesn't like your religion. And freedom of religion includes how you dress. What I mean is, Americans are free to wear any kind of religious clothing they prefer. For example, some religions require people to cover their heads all the time, while others require people to take their hats off, for example, in church. Both of these forms of expression are legal. All right, now the next freedom listed in the First Amendment is maybe the most famous one, because it's the one that all of us practice every single day, and that's freedom of speech. What does that mean exactly? Basically, it means you're free to talk openly about your ideas, even if other people disagree with them. You're also free to read or listen to other people's ideas. But in addition, freedom of speech includes what we call symbolic speech, like wearing the clothes you like. In fact, the courts have said that freedom of speech includes all forms of expression, meaning words, pictures, music, even the way you wear your hair. The third freedom, freedom of press, means the freedom to publish books and articles in newspapers, magazines, and even the internet. Journalists and publishers have the right to publish different ideas and opinions. Let's say you open a magazine and you see a cartoon making a joke about the president. You might ask yourself, is that legal? And the answer is yes. It's also perfectly legal for a journalist to write an article criticizing the government. You can open the newspaper any day and find articles that criticize the government for, raising taxes, or not protecting the environment, or, well, of course, military activities in other countries. Journalists are free to agree or disagree with these actions and express their opinions without fear. The First Amendment lists two other freedoms as well: freedom of assembly and freedom of petition. Freedom of assembly means very simply the right to meet in groups. When students participate in demonstrations on college campuses, for example, they are using their right of assembly and the right of free speech at the same time. And the fifth and last freedom is the freedom of petition, which means citizens have the right to ask the government to change laws or change policies. In other words, it means that citizens can complain about the government's actions. I've listed these 5 freedoms separately, but in real life, we often use the term freedom of expression to talk about all of them. Freedom of expression means the right that Americans have to express their views in any form they prefer. For example, by speaking, writing a letter to their senator, demonstrating in the streets, writing a song, or painting a picture.
Lecture, Part 2, First Amendment Controversies. Using a map to organize your notes. Page 35.
Perhaps you're wondering, does the First Amendment mean Americans are completely free to say and do whatever they want? And of course, the answer is no. There are limits, but trying to decide where and what they are can be very controversial. Let's look at the kinds of questions that our courts deal with all the time. The first question is, what are the limits of free speech? You see, in practice, there are some restrictions. For example, it's never legal to publish lies about people. But should it be legal to burn the U.S. flag as a form of criticism against the government? Some people say yes, because the First Amendment guarantees free expression. But many other people disagree. They think flag burning is unpatriotic and insults the country. You might be surprised to hear that the Supreme Court has ruled that flag burning is legal, but this is very controversial. Here's another question. Should children be allowed to bring cell phones to school? Many teachers and principals say no because cell phones make noise in class, and they've tried to forbid cell phones or take them away from children. However, many parents say they need to have a way to get in touch with their children, and they also say that using a cell phone is a form of free speech. Let's look at another controversial question that often comes up. What does freedom of religion actually mean in practice? For example, do you think children should have the right to say prayers in public schools? Some people say yes, because the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, right? But other people say no, because the First Amendment also says there cannot be any national religion. And since public schools are open to children of all religions, these people believe there shouldn't be any religious activities in these schools. Basically, the courts have said that students can pray at school privately, but they can't do it during class time, and the school or the teachers cannot organize or encourage any kind of religious activity. So to conclude what I've been saying, the freedoms promised in the First Amendment can be very controversial. However, freedom of speech is a basic right guaranteed by the Constitution. Unit 2, A Diverse Nation. Chapter 3,
The origins of diversity. Getting started. Listening for numerical information. Page 45.
Between 1820 and 1830, only about 15,000 immigrants entered the United States. Around 1830, however, immigration to the U.S. began to rise steadily. In spite of a slight dip in the 1860s, immigration continued to climb throughout the rest of the century. The rate fell sharply in the 1890s, but that trend quickly reversed itself. In the first decade of the 20th century, immigration figures rose dramatically. From 1900 to 1910, between 8 and 9 million immigrants entered the country, the highest number of immigrants up to that point in U.S. history. Most of these immigrants came to the U.S. through Ellis Island in New York City. Immigration began to fall again in the 1910s, however. It continued falling after World War I began in 1914. The number of immigrants dropped even further after the United States entered the war in 1917. New laws were passed in the 1920s that limited immigration, and the Great Depression had begun as well. All of these factors acted to slow down the immigration rate. Only 700,000 immigrants entered the country in the 1930s, and the numbers were even lower in the 1940s. Immigration increased quickly after World War II. Now it's climbing rapidly again. Immigration figures today are higher than they've ever been. Over 10 million people entered the U.S. in the first decade of this century.
Interview 1. Immigration to the United States in the 1860s. Answering true-false questions. Page 48.
Patrick, where did your family come from originally?
Ireland. My grandparents both came from the same small village in Ireland. First, my grandfather came over in the 1860s, and then as soon as he got a job, my grandmother came too. You know, back then that was the big thing. It was America, America, America. Anyway, after my grandparents immigrated, all the brothers and sisters came too, and everyone else in the family too. My father came from a big family. There were 10 boys and 1 girl, and who knows how many cousins.
That's a big family.
Yeah. See, the ones in America would send letters back to Ireland, and the letters would say, "Come on over, there are plenty of jobs over here." You see, over in Ireland, people were desperate. I'm talking about the mid to late 19th century. And that was the time when, as you probably know, there was a potato famine. That happened in 1848. There was just no food, and people were dying of hunger. It's difficult to imagine this, but about 1 million people died at that time. But in America, there was opportunity, so the Irish started coming over in massive numbers.
What was life like for them here?
Well, they stuck together. The relatives helped the other relatives get jobs, because one thing that's very important to the Irish is family. They think it's very important to help each other out.
So what happened?
Well, what happened was that the new immigrants had to share their apartments, which wasn't always easy. And they didn't have a lot of money. I think a lot of people arrived with less than $50 in their pockets, so they depended on each other to survive. And then they were Catholic. That set them apart. I've heard there was a lot of prejudice against them because they had different religious beliefs. But on the other hand, they made a lot of contributions to society.
What kind of contributions did they make?
Well, they got involved in city politics as voters and elected officials, and they worked hard. in factories, for example, and construction work, and in the police force. A lot of them were firefighters, and in these ways they played a very important role in the community.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 48. Excerpt 1.
My grandparents both came from the same small village in Ireland. First, my grandfather came over in the 1860s, and then as soon as he got a job, my grandmother came too. You know, back then that was the big thing. It was America, America, America.
Excerpt 2.
Over in Ireland, people were desperate. I'm talking about the mid to late 19th century. And that was the time when, as you probably know, there was a potato famine. That happened in 1848. There was just no food, and people were dying of hunger. It's difficult to imagine this, but about 1 million people died at that time.
Excerpt 3.
They got involved in city politics as voters and elected officials, and they worked hard in factories, for example, and construction work, and in the police force. A lot of them were firefighters, and in these ways they played a very important role in the community.
Interview 2. Immigration to the United States in the 1900s. Listening for specific information. Page 50.
Eunice and John, your families both came to the U.S. in the early 1900s. Could you tell me their stories? Eunice, would you begin?
Well, my family is Jewish, and they came from Russia. And for a lot of Jews, there was always a fear of religious persecution. Thousands of Jews were killed in Russia. But in America, there was freedom to practice our religion.
So they came for religious freedom.
But it wasn't only for religion, it was political freedom too. Because in Russia at that time, if you criticized the government, you'd end up in jail. And then the third reason they came here was for the economic opportunities. They wanted the chance to have better jobs and to live more comfortably. They also wanted to make a better life for their children. That's what happened to my grandparents.
So did they have a better life in the United States?
Well, they did have more freedom, but they were very poor. My mother used to talk a lot about what it was like when she was a child. You know what the kids got for a gift? An orange. And this was so valued, this piece of fruit. So what I mean is, my family had almost no money at all. But life was difficult in other ways, too. In the United States, it was harder to keep the family close. I think that was probably the hardest thing of all.
And John, what about your family?
Well, my family's Italian. My grandparents came from a small village in the south of Italy where my grandfather's family had all been fishermen. Life was very hard for them too, because the economy was bad and they couldn't make a living.
What was it like for them to leave Italy?
Well, it wasn't easy. The trip alone was a nightmare. I heard a lot of people died on the boat. And when they finally arrived, they were almost penniless. And of course, they didn't speak the language.
What happened after they arrived?
Let's see. My grandfather got a job in a factory while my grandmother took care of the children and worked part-time. They had 9 kids. And my father was the youngest one of those 9 kids.
That was a big family.
Yes, it was. And times were pretty tough, because when my parents were born, it was the 1930s, the time of the Depression. But my father was a good student, and he ended up getting a scholarship to college. My father was the first one in his family to graduate from college. That gave him a lot more opportunities.
You sound very proud of him.
I am. You know, as I look back on it, I see that my family struggled hard to make a better life in this country. And there was, like, a kind of a feeling of living in 2 different worlds because they spoke 2 languages and had 2 cultures. But they were proud of it. And I am too.
Lecture Gerald Meyer, Immigrants to America, Challenges and Contributions. Before the lecture, listening for transitional phrases that introduce supporting details. Page 55. 1.
The four major groups that immigrated to the U.S. during this time were Germans, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, and Italians. Of course, there were many other immigrants, for instance, from Greece, Hungary, China, and Mexico.
2.
Some Americans were worried about the size and diversity of the new foreign population. You have to remember that millions of immigrants arrived during this time. In fact, almost 30 million of them.
3.
Most people in the United States were Protestants, and they were often prejudiced against Catholics and also against Jews. One reason for this was that the immigrants' religious practices and traditions seemed strange to them.
4.
The Irish, on the other hand, helped build the infrastructure of many American cities. In other words, the canals, the bridges, the railroads, the seaports, and the roads.
Lecture Part 1. Immigrants Face Challenges. Using telegraphic language. Page 57.
Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you about the experience of immigrants who came to the United States from the middle of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th centuries, from, about 1840 to about 1917. Now, as you know, there was some strong prejudice against these early immigrants. But even so, these groups were able to make important and lasting contributions to American society. So, for the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss both of these parts of the immigrant experience, the prejudice as well as the contributions. Now, just to remind you, the four major groups that immigrated to the U.S. during this time were Germans, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, and Italians. Of course, there were many other immigrants, for instance, from Greece, Hungary, China, and Mexico. Many of them met with prejudice in this country. Some Americans called them cruel names or mistreated them. Sometimes they refused to rent apartments to immigrants or give them jobs. So now, what were some of the reasons for this? Well, to begin with, some Americans were worried about the size and diversity of the new foreign population. You have to remember that millions of immigrants arrived during this time. In fact, almost 30 million of them. And most of them crowded into cities in the eastern and northern parts of the United States. I'm sure it was frightening for many Americans to see so many strangers moving into their cities. But there were other reasons for the prejudice against immigrants, too. Many immigrants faced prejudice because they had different religious beliefs. Most people in the United States were Protestants, and they were often prejudiced against Catholics and also against Jews. One reason for this was that the immigrants' religious practices and traditions seemed strange to them. Then, third, there was prejudice against new immigrants who spoke different languages and had unfamiliar customs, different foods, different clothes, things like that. Also, many Americans were afraid that the immigrants wouldn't share their democratic values. For example, there was a lot of prejudice against the Germans around the time of the First World War because the United States was fighting against Germany, and people thought Germans living in America might be unpatriotic. And finally, many Americans were afraid that with all these immigrants coming over, they would lose their jobs, that the immigrants would work for less money than they would. And so, for all these reasons, immigrants were seen as a threat to the American way of life.
Lecture Part 2. Immigrants Make Contributions. Organizing your notes in columns. Page 59.
What you have to remember is that this time, it was a time of great expansion in America. Cities and industries were growing, and a lot of people were moving west, so the country needed a large number of new workers. A lot of these new workers were immigrants who made many important and lasting contributions to the development of the country. For example, many Germans became farmers. They were good at farming and made important improvements to U.S. farming methods. In addition, Germans also worked as tailors, bakers, and butchers. The Irish, on the other hand, helped build the infrastructure of many American cities. In other words, the canals, the bridges, the railroads, the seaports, and the roads. Many were skilled workers, like plumbers, and others were unskilled factory workers. Jews, who, as I said before, were mostly from Eastern Europe at this time, and Italians also made important contributions to the nation. For example, as the years went by, many Jews became involved in popular music and entertainment. They were also important to the development of American education and sciences. Many also worked in the clothing industry. The Italians, like the Irish, were important in the construction industry and in the building of roads, canals, bridges, buildings, and railroads. Immigrants brought languages, foods, music, religions, beliefs, and different lifestyles to the U.S. In the end, there's no doubt that they made important contributions to the economy and culture of the United States.
Unit 2, A Diverse Nation. Chapter 4, Diversity in the United States of Today. Getting started. Listening for percentages and fractions. Page 64.
Chart 1 shows immigration to the United States between 1901 and 1940. At this time, 79% of immigrants came from Europe. 6% came from Latin America, and 4% came from Asia. 11% came from other places. Chart 2 shows immigration to the United States between 1941 and 1980. During this period, 34%, or about one-third of all immigrants, came from Europe. Another 34% came from Latin America, and 19% came from Asia. 13% came from other places. Chart 3 shows immigration to the United States between 1981 and 2000. 47%, almost half of all immigrants, came from Latin America, and 34% came from Asia. Only 13% came from Europe, and 6% came from other places.
Interview 1. Reasons for coming to the United States. Listening for specific information. Page 66.
Agustin, where are you from, and how long have you been in the U.S.?
I'm from Mexico. I've been here, over 20 years now.
And why did you come?
Well, the reason I came, like most Mexicans, I suppose, was to work. In my country, there aren't enough jobs. It's hard to make a living.
And what was your biggest difficulty when you came here?
The hardest thing for me at first was that I didn't know anyone, except for my brother. I was lucky that he helped me a lot. He sent me money, he gave me a place to live, and he helped me find a job.
And how are you doing now?
I'm doing well. When I first came, I was washing dishes, but I didn't want to get stuck doing that. Now I work in a food store, and I work directly with people.
And don't you miss your family in Mexico?
Sure, but we're often in contact. I always send money and presents back home.
Nadezhda, what about you? Where were you born, and how long have you been in the U.S.?
I was born in Russia, and I've been here about 6 years.
And why did you come?
Well, mainly because of my children. In the United States, I feel that I can build a better life for them, a rich life with many possibilities.
What kind of possibilities?
Education. There are more educational opportunities in America. I dream of giving my kids an excellent education. I think that's the most important goal in life.
Was it hard to leave Russia?
Yes, it was, because I love my country. And, well, my mother is still there, and it was very difficult for me to leave her. But I made a sacrifice for my children. And we're doing well. In fact, I just became a citizen.
Congratulations, Nadezhda. Okay, now, Chow, you're from...
China.
And how long have you been here, and why did you come?
I've been here for 10 years. I came for 2 reasons. The first reason was to join my parents, who were already in the US. They left me behind in China with my aunt until they got jobs. But I missed them a lot. And the second reason was to study. I want to become a physician's assistant. It's easier to get that kind of training in the US.
Have you had any difficulties?
Well, it's hard to work and study at the same time. And then it was also difficult to learn English. At home, we speak Chinese. Only Chinese. And at work, I work in a tofu factory. I only speak Chinese there too. It's hard, but I love living in America because you can meet people from all over the world, and I'm studying to make my dream come true.
Interview 2. Adapting to life in the United States. Listening for specific information. Page 67.
Mateo, your family is from the Dominican Republic, right?
Yeah, my family is, but I grew up in the States. I came here when I was 13.
Okay, so let me ask you, do you think you're American or Dominican?
Let's put it this way. I'm a combination of 2 cultures. I'm American on the outside, but I'm Dominican inside. That's kind of like being a hybrid.
How do you mean?
Well, see, whenever I'm at home, we always speak Spanish because my parents speak very little English. When I go into the house, I feel as if I'm in my home country. I listen to Latin music, I eat Dominican food. You know, it doesn't feel at all American. But whenever I step outside the door, I step into a different world where they speak English and have a completely different culture. So I'm constantly going back and forth between the 2 cultures.
That's a good way to explain it, Mateo. Thanks. Now, Min-soo, I know you're from Korea, right?
Yes, I've lived here for about 5 years. I came here because there are a lot more opportunities for women here.
Your English is very good. Do you speak it at home?
No, I only speak Korean. It's easier to express myself. I only speak English at work and in college.
Is it difficult for you to speak English?
No, not really. The only time it's hard is when, well, in school, for instance, the professor expects us to speak in front of everyone else. I'm not used to giving my opinion in class. In Korea, students are supposed to take notes and do their homework, not talk in class all the time.
Would you say you're more Korean or more American?
I think half and half, 50-50. I have my Korean culture, but I'm absorbing American culture fast.
And Abdulaziz, what about you? You were originally from...
Niger. That's where I grew up. I came here as an adult.
And you speak...
Well, it depends on the situation. I speak English at work and school, but I speak French with my friends, and I speak Hausa, an African language, when I call my family back home.
Isn't it hard for you to keep switching languages?
Yes, it feels very strange. I feel as if I'm changing my identity every time I switch in and out of English. I keep asking myself, who am I? Am I Nigerian? Am I American? Or am I a mixture of both?
And does that feeling ever get any easier?
Yes, because as my English gets better, I find that I'm changing. I think I'm becoming more and more American these days. My mother says I'm not as formal as I used to be.
Listening for stressed words. Page 68. Excerpt 1.
So I'm constantly going back and forth between the two cultures.
Excerpt 2.
I came here because there are a lot more opportunities for women here.
Excerpt 3.
My mother says I'm not as formal as I used to be.
Lecture. Betty Jordan. Recent Immigrants and Today's United States. Before the lecture. Listening for definitions. Page 72. 1.
Metaphors are figures of speech that help us understand complex ideas. They're a kind of comparison.
2.
A melting pot is a large metal pot, a kind of container, that's used for melting things such as different metals or foods.
3.
A salad is a dish made up of different vegetables that are mixed together.
4.
A patchwork quilt is a cover for a bed that's made from pieces of colorful cloth sewn together.
5.
A kaleidoscope is a kind of tube that you look through, and if you turn it, you can see complex, changing patterns.
Lecture. Part 1. Metaphors for American Society. Reviewing and revising notes. Page 76.
American society today is more diverse and more complex than ever. Over the years, historians and writers have used different metaphors to try to describe this complex American culture. What I'd like to do today is first describe 4 of those metaphors to you, and then in the second part of the lecture, talk about transnationalism. Transnationalism is a word that describes the relationship that recent immigrants continue to have with their home countries. All right, to begin, let's talk about what a metaphor is. Metaphors are figures of speech that help us understand complex ideas. They're a kind of comparison. Let's look at our first slide here. This is probably the oldest metaphor for describing American society. It's a melting pot. A melting pot is a large metal pot, a kind of container, that's used for melting things such as different metals or foods. You put different ingredients in the pot, color and taste. The ingredients all melt together and become something new. The picture you're looking at is of a fondue. That's a dish from Switzerland that has cheese and other ingredients, but it's melted so the original ingredients disappear, and the result is something new and different. This metaphor became popular at the beginning of the 20th century. And so according to this metaphor, all immigrants coming into the U.S. would lose their separate identities and assimilate, or mix with the people who were already here, and everybody would come together to create a new and unique culture. You see? But one problem with this metaphor is that it doesn't always describe reality, especially today's reality, which is that although some immigrants do assimilate, many of them have a different experience. For example, some groups are not accepted by the larger society, or maybe they don't want to mix in completely. So instead, what happens is that many immigrants keep parts of their own cultural identity. For example, they may continue to speak their own language. They may celebrate their own traditional holidays. They usually marry someone from their own race, their own ethnic group, and they might never say they are American even if they live here most of their lives. So if the melting pot isn't a good metaphor for describing American culture, what is? Let's look at the next slide here. A salad in a salad bowl. Of course, a salad is a dish made up of different vegetables that are mixed together, but in a salad, each ingredient keeps its own. So this metaphor represents America as a diverse culture made of different races, ethnic groups, cultures, and languages that live together, but each group may keep parts of its own culture. Do you understand what I mean? Some people prefer other metaphors for America, like the patchwork quilt. A patchwork quilt is a cover for a bed that's made from pieces of colorful cloth sewn together. Some people like this picture of America because it shows that we're all unique, but we're all connected, like the pieces of a quilt. And then a fourth metaphor, you see it here, is a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope is a kind of tube that you look through, and if you turn it, you can see complex, changing patterns. This is the metaphor I like best because it's very dynamic. What I mean is that it shows America as a beautiful picture, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society that is always changing.
Lecture, Part 2, Transnationalism. Using bullets to organize your notes. Page 77.
So today's immigrants often keep parts of their own cultural identity at the same time as they become part of mainstream American society. Today's immigrants also maintain some kind of relationship with their countries of origin. I mean the countries where they or their parents were born. And the word that's used to describe this relationship is transnationalism, which comes from trans, meaning across, and nationalism, which is, of course, related to the word nation. So a transnational is a person whose experience goes across nations or cultures. Many immigrants own homes, land, or businesses in their country of origin. For instance, I have a student who's building a vacation home in Colombia, even though he lives in New York. Other examples, immigrants may send money to family members in their native countries. They might continue to support sports teams there. They may travel home frequently, and they may even get involved in business or political affairs there. My neighbor, who's Japanese, has a business in Tokyo in addition to his business in the US. He travels there at least 5 or 6 times a year to take care of it. Now, why do you think immigrants today have a closer relationship with their home countries than immigrants did in the past? Well, there are different factors that make this possible, like ease of travel and new technology. See, travel is now more convenient and less expensive than it was years ago, so people can go back and forth between the US and their homeland more often. Second, communication technology has obviously advanced a lot too, so it's easy for people to stay in contact by phone or by internet. It's also easier to send money to other countries. So I hope our discussion has helped you to see that immigrants today have a complex relationship with their new country, America, as well as their countries of origin.
Unit 3, The Struggle for Equality. Chapter 5, The Struggle Begins. Getting started. Building background knowledge on the topic. Page 87. A.
This is a picture of the Declaration of Independence, adopted on July 4th, 1776. It includes the famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal."
B.
This picture shows an African American man drinking water at a segregated water fountain. Scenes like this were common in the South during the Jim Crow era, which lasted from about 1880 until the 1960s.
C.
This picture shows American women demonstrating for the right to vote. Women won this right in 1920, when the U.S. Congress passed the 19th Amendment.
D.
This picture shows African Americans protesting school segregation. Legal segregation of public schools ended in 1954 in a Supreme Court case called Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka.
Interview 1. A personal encounter with segregation. Listening for answers to WH questions. Page 89.
Hi, Cynthia. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I'm from New York, but my family's from the South. My parents grew up in South Carolina.
Well, I'd like to ask you about your childhood in the early 1950s. What was it like before the civil rights movement? What do you remember from that period?
I was a young girl then, and one very clear memory I have is that in August every year, my parents would take us down on a long trip from New York to the South to reconnect with the family down there.
Reconnect?
Yes, to spend the summer together as a family.
How did you get down there?
Well, we traveled by car. So we'd fill the car with pillows for all the children, and we took all kinds of things to eat because we weren't sure you could buy food on the road. You had to plan the food you might need. Snacks for the children, sandwiches.
Did you know that things were different in the South? Were you aware of segregation?
Well, I'm going to tell you about the moment when I think I really became aware. On one of these trips, I remember that we stopped at a gas station, and I jumped out of the car and ran over to get a drink of water from the water fountain. And before I knew it, the owner of the gas station came over and grabbed me, and he swung me around and pointed to the sign that said whites only, and he shouted, "Can't you read?"
You were only a little girl. How did that make you feel?
Well, I remember that I was really startled and obviously scared.
And then what happened?
Well, my father came over, and he seemed really angry, and he told me to get back in the car right away. I ran over and jumped into the back seat, and we drove off. And I kept asking my father why he was so angry, but he wouldn't speak for a long, long time. And then, finally, many miles down the road, he stopped the car, and he told us to never, ever leave my mother or him because he couldn't guarantee our safety. And I remember being really confused and upset. No one said anything. It was a terrible experience for all of us.
Oh, I can imagine.
It was just awful. And you know, in recent years, I've tried to talk to my family about that event. My father still doesn't want to talk about it, about how helpless he felt because he couldn't protect his family. But my mother sometimes talks about it. She understands how hard it was for him to be in that position.
That period had a dramatic impact on so many people.
Yes, it's difficult to forget that time. Today, of course, there's been some progress toward equality. After all, in 2008, we elected an African American as President of the United States. And I am positive and optimistic about the future. But I don't think we can forget the challenges that still exist.
Interview 2. An inspiring time. Listening for specific information. Page 91.
Hilda, can you talk a little bit about the changes you've seen for women since you were younger?
Well, since I was born, there have been incredible changes. It's hard to explain, but life is very different for women these days, compared to when I was young, I mean.
Do you mind if I ask how old you are now?
No, not at all. I'm in my 70s. And when I went to high school back in the 50s, the typical family was not the same as now. Back then, everyone had a specific role.
A specific role? What do you mean?
Well, there was a father who worked outside the house, a mother who was a housewife, and usually 2 or 3 children. At least, that was the stereotype. That's what people expected a family to be like.
Did your family fit that description?
Yes, it did. My mother stayed home and took care of the children. She did the laundry and the cooking and the shopping. And, in fact, all the women in my neighborhood were exactly like my mother. My brother went to college. He was the first one in the family, actually. But there was never any discussion of me going to college. Because you know what? Women didn't go to college. They got married and then they had children. You know what people used to say? They said, "You don't need a college education to change diapers."
So, in other words, they expected you to settle down and get married.
Yes. If you were a really successful woman, you could marry a doctor or a lawyer.
Is that what you wanted too?
No, I didn't. I was very ambitious. Do you know what I wanted? I wanted to be a secretary.
A secretary? Not a doctor or a lawyer?
No, a secretary. Look, I know that doesn't sound very exciting today, but back then, that was my dream. So I studied typing in high school, and then I graduated and worked as a secretary. I felt as if I was really making progress. Actually, it took a while until I realized that I could do even better than that.
And what happened to make you realize that?
Well, in 1965, there was a big women's demonstration in Chicago, where I lived, and I went. And it was phenomenal. The streets were full of women protesting. They wanted to have the same opportunities as men did, to be able to work in any job they wanted to. And you know, those kinds of demands opened my eyes. I thought, I can get an education and make something of myself. So after that, I walked into college and registered.
You did? That's great.
Yes, and I went to college, and my whole life changed. I became a teacher. Maybe that doesn't seem so exciting either, but back then it was a big deal.
What do you think of the opportunities young women have today?
Today, the situation is so much better. Young girls learn that they can do any job they want. You know, you look around, and there are women everywhere. The bus driver can be a woman, or the doctor can be a woman. And women see men in different roles, too. There are men who are nurses and homemakers. When I was young, these were considered women's jobs.
Listening for stressed words. Page 91. Excerpt 1.
Life is very different for women these days.
Excerpt 2.
There was never any discussion of me going to college.
Excerpt 3.
I thought, I can get an education and make something of myself.
Lecture. Julia Smith. The Civil Rights Movement and the Women's Movement. Before the lecture. Listening for guiding questions. Page 96. 1.
So these are just a few examples of important events in the early struggle for civil rights. What happened next? Well, these events led to more protests, more demonstrations, and more sit-ins throughout the 60s.
2.
Today, we can look back and be thankful for the great achievements of the civil rights movement. What were some of these achievements? Well, first, the Jim Crow laws were overturned.
3.
A journalist named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. It was based on interviews with white middle-class women living in the suburbs. And what do you think Friedan discovered? That these women were very unhappy with their lives because of their lack of freedom and their lack of a sense of identity.
4.
Was the women's movement successful? In some ways, yes, of course. Today, equal pay for equal work is the law.
Lecture. Part 1. The Civil Rights Movement. Creating your own symbols and abbreviations. Page 98.
The topic of today's lecture is the civil rights movement and the women's movement. Let's see. To begin, let me remind you that the 60s was a time of great and often violent change in the United States. There were many political and social movements. I'm going to be speaking to you about two important movements that not only involved thousands of people all over the nation, but also led to new laws that gave us many of the rights we have today. First, I'm going to talk about the civil rights movement. Do you know about this period in U.S. history? The civil rights movement was the struggle by hundreds of thousands of people working over many years to achieve equal rights for African Americans. You see, almost 100 years after the end of slavery in the United States, segregation and discrimination against blacks was still common. For example, blacks in many states still couldn't eat in the same places as whites. They couldn't swim in the same swimming pools as whites or sit down on a bus if a white person was standing. The anger that black people felt over these unfair conditions is what started the civil rights movement. It's difficult to point to the year that the movement began, but there were several key historical events. On December 1st, 1955, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person. This led to the famous Montgomery bus boycott. For 1 year, the entire black community refused to ride on the city buses. The bus company lost a great deal of money, and in the end, the Alabama courts ruled that racial segregation on buses was unconstitutional. And the city of Montgomery was forced to change its policy. A few years later, in 1960, black students in North Carolina refused to leave a restaurant when the owner wouldn't serve them food because of their color. This kind of protest, they were called sit-ins because people would sit and refuse to leave. This kind of protest soon spread like fire all over the South. And how many of you have heard of Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, in 1963, there was a huge national demonstration in Washington, D.C. called the March on Washington, where about 200,000 people heard King give his famous I Have a Dream speech. So these are just a few examples of important events in the early struggle for civil rights. What happened next? Well, these events led to more protests, more demonstrations, and more sit-ins throughout the 60s, with hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, black and white, struggling together to stop prejudice and discrimination. Today, we can look back and be thankful for the great achievements of the civil rights movement. What were some of these achievements? Well, first, the Jim Crow laws were overturned. This meant that segregation became illegal. Second, the federal government passed laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the rights of black Americans. Finally, and maybe most important of all, the successes of the civil rights movement led other groups to begin fighting for justice and equality.
Lecture, Part 2, The Women's Movement. Organizing your notes in a chart. Page 100.
Now, the women's movement was related in some ways to the civil rights movement, and that's what we'll turn to next. I'm going to tell you about some important events in the history of the movement from the 1940s until today, and talk about the movement's main achievements. Now, were you aware that during World War II, when thousands of men were fighting in Europe and Asia, women took over the men's jobs? They worked in factories, in construction, in offices, anywhere they were needed. However, in 1945, when the men returned from the war, the women had to leave many of those jobs and go back home, back to their roles as wives and mothers. But by the 1950s, more and more women were feeling dissatisfied with these roles. You see, although about 30% of women worked outside the home, they were often paid much less than half of what men earned, even if they were doing the same job. Plus, women didn't have the same opportunities as men They could be teachers or nurses or secretaries. The few women working in business had almost no chance to become managers or executives, even if they were qualified and worked hard. Then in 1963, a journalist named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. It was based on interviews with white middle-class women living in the suburbs. And what do you think Friedan discovered? That these women were very unhappy with their lives because of their lack of freedom and their lack of a sense of identity. This book shocked America. It became a huge bestseller. And nowadays, looking back, we can say it marked the beginning of the modern women's movement. Starting in the mid-1960s, after The Feminine Mystique came out, women began to organize and work hard for equal opportunity. They marched in the streets, they tried to elect more women to Congress, they gave speeches, and they wrote letters. They demanded equal opportunities for women in education and at work. They asked, why shouldn't women be able to be doctors, lawyers, business professionals, as well as police officers, firefighters, and construction workers? Of course, these were professions that women didn't traditionally do, but they didn't stop there. Another one of their key demands was equal pay for equal work. So looking back, was the women's movement successful? In some ways, yes, of course. Today, equal pay for equal work is the law. More women than men go to college these days. More students in medical school are women than men. There are women politicians, women on the Supreme Court, and women who are university presidents. It is certainly true that women today have more control over their lives than they did 50 years ago, but we still have work to do. For example, women today still earn only about 80 cents for every dollar that a man earns. And if a woman has a baby, she often risks her job. So we've made great progress, but inequalities still exist.
Unit 3. The Struggle for Equality. Chapter 6. The Struggle Continues. Getting Started. Listening for Specific Information. Page 104. 1.
My name is Peter. I'm 55 years old, and 5 months ago, I lost my job as a computer programmer after working for the same company for 16 years. My boss said the company was losing money and didn't have enough work for me to do. But I heard that they just hired a new programmer who's 26 years old. He's very energetic, but he just doesn't have as much experience as me.
2.
My name is Teresa, and I'm a journalist. Last week, I had a job interview at a magazine. The interview went great until the end, when suddenly the interviewer asked me if I was pregnant. I told him the truth. Yes, I am pregnant, but I plan to continue working after my baby is born. But, well, I didn't get the job.
3.
My name is Robert. I'm married and I have 3 children. Last week, my wife and I filled out an application to rent a new apartment. It's close to my work, and a good friend of ours also lives in the building. Our friend told the manager that we are quiet, responsible people, but we didn't get the apartment. Our friend thinks it's because nobody else in the building has children, and the manager is worried that our kids will make noise.
4.
My name is Rebecca. I'm a university student, and I use a wheelchair. One of my classes is on the 8th floor, and the building has only 2 elevators, so I've been late to class a few times. I explained the problem to the professor, but he says it doesn't matter. He expects me to get to class on time, just like everybody else.
Interview 1. Issues of Inequality. Listening for Main Ideas. Page 107.
Hello, Jairo. You're Colombian, right?
Yeah, I was born in Colombia, but I moved to the United States many years ago. I'm a college professor.
Is it true that Latinos are the largest minority group in the United States?
Yes, it is.
Hispanics make up something like 16% of the U.S. population. It's also the fastest growing minority group, which is why they are an important group to focus on if you are talking about the struggle for equal rights.
What kind of issues do Hispanics confront?
Well, the first thing is that they are very important to the country, and that needs to be recognized. As a group, we have made significant contributions to American society. There are Latinos in every sphere of American life, as workers in the economy and in sports and entertainment too. And we've made important political contributions. About 300 cities have mayors who are Latinos, and there are more Latino members in Congress than ever before.
Apart from the need for more recognition, what are some other issues that Latinos face?
Well, there is a need to provide basic government services in Spanish for non-English speakers. For example, hospitals should have interpreters so that patients don't have to struggle to explain their symptoms in English. And children who don't speak English need to have more help in school. These things are happening to some extent already, but as the Latino population gets bigger, these programs have to be expanded. And by the way, this also applies to people who speak other languages, like Chinese or Russian.
And what about the future? What other progress would you like to see?
Well, there's still a lot of poverty in the Hispanic community. Over 25% of Latinos still live below the poverty level compared to only 15% for the rest of the population. And poverty creates other problems, of course. Large numbers of Latinos can't get good health care. I hope that will improve in the future.
I hope you're right, Jairo. Thanks. Now, what about you, Sandy? Is there another group you'd like to comment on?
Well, if we're talking about the need for more equality, I think we need to talk about senior citizens.
Have they made progress toward greater equality?
Well, in some ways they have. Like, since the 1960s, it's been illegal to discriminate against people because of their age. At work, for example, it's illegal to hire or fire someone because they're old.
So that's progress, isn't it?
Well, yes and no. What I mean is, there's still discrimination. For instance, my father's in his late 50s now, and recently he lost his job because his company was downsizing. And, he's had a lot of trouble finding a new job. I'm sure it's because he's an older worker.
But didn't you just say there was a law protecting the rights of older workers?
Well, yes, there are laws, but they're really hard to enforce. A lot of times bosses think there's a risk to hiring older people. Perhaps they think older people might get sick, that's one thing. But older people often get higher salaries because they have more experience. The boss won't say this, so there's no obvious discrimination, but he'll think it. And if he's got 2 applicants for a job, and one is older, and the other one is younger, he'll hire the younger one. That's what happened to my dad. We still need to work toward changing people's stereotypes about older people.
Interview 2. Working with the blind. Listening for specific information. Page 108.
Hi, Robin. I understand you work with the blind.
Yes, that's right. I work with people who are either partly or completely blind. And basically, I try to help them participate fully and equally in our society, especially at work.
At work?
Sure, because, for example, there are lots of office jobs that blind people can do nowadays, now that there are computers that can talk and software that prints documents in Braille.
Really?
And work is really important. Of course, it gives you a salary, which is obviously one of the main reasons for having a job. But a job is more than just about money. A job gives you something to do. It gives you an identity, something to talk about and be involved with.
So what exactly do you do?
Well, I help people who are blind learn the basic skills they need to become independent.
Could you give me some examples?
Well, think about your day. Think about all the things that you have to do when you get up, go out of the house, and get to work. Now, imagine doing all those things without being able to see. The everyday tasks that most people take for granted can be really demanding if you can't see anything. But there are many simple gadgets and techniques that can help blind people function better.
Like what?
Well, for example, it's useful to have a talking clock. It's just like a regular clock, but it says the time. And there are other items, too, that make life easier, like a tray, which is one of the simplest aids that blind people can use.
A tray? How would they use a tray?
A tray helps you to keep all your things together. If you put something down on the tray, you know exactly where it is, so you can pick it up again.
Ah, interesting.
Yes, and then there's money. By folding a bill a certain way, you can tell what kind of bill it is. You leave singles flat. You fold fives from side to side, and tens from top to bottom. You fold 20s both ways. That way, you don't need to rely on other people all the time to help you. Obviously, someone has to help you fold the bills once, but after that, you can learn to take care of things on your own.
I would never have thought of that.
Well, you see, these are simple things that help blind people to live regular lives. Imagine people feeling that their problems are overwhelming, and then they learn how to do things on their own, and it's as if a new world has opened to them. It's very inspiring to watch that process. That's why I love my job.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 109. Excerpt 1.
There are lots of office jobs that blind people can do nowadays, now that there are computers that can talk and software that prints documents in Braille.
Excerpt 2.
Well, think about your day. Think about all the things that you have to do when you get up, go out of the house, and get to work. Now, imagine doing all those things without being able to see.
Excerpt 3.
Imagine people feeling that their problems are overwhelming, and then they learn how to do things on their own, and it's as if a new world has opened to them. It's very inspiring to watch that process. That's why I love my job.
Lecture. David Sacheret. 2 Important Laws in the Struggle for Equality. Before the lecture. Listening for signal words and phrases. Page 115. 1.
Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants.
2.
Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed. Second, what it does. And third, well, its impact.
3.
Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants.
4.
Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person.
5.
In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position.
6.
The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness.
7.
In terms of mental disabilities, there's been progress too.
8.
But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think.
9.
In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around.
Lecture, Part 1. The Age Discrimination in Employment Act. Indenting, page 117.
Hello, everyone. Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants. But today, I'll talk about two other groups: the elderly, senior citizens, and the disabled. The laws that I'll talk about specifically are the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed, second, what it does, and third, well, its impact. So first of all, why did the United States need this law? Well, the law tried to correct several problems, mainly that older people faced a lot of discrimination in the workplace. Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants. For example, they might say that only applicants under age 35 could apply. The law tries to change the situation. Basically, it protects people over 40 years old from discrimination at work, and it covers a lot of areas. Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person. And employers cannot fire older people because of their age either. In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position or give them particular jobs. The impact of this law has been quite significant. If you're applying for a job nowadays, you won't see anything about age on an application. And a second example is that older workers can get the same benefits as younger people, health insurance, and so on. Also, in most cases, mandatory retirement is not allowed nowadays. In other words, your company cannot force you to retire. You might ask, do employers actually follow this law? Well, there are still many thousands of legal complaints about age discrimination each year, so we have to be realistic about this. There is still some discrimination against older workers. For example, a recent study showed that companies are more than 40% more likely to interview a younger job applicant than an older job applicant. However, people are definitely more aware of age discrimination than they were before.
Lecture, Part 2. The Americans with Disabilities Act. Using an outline. Page 119.
Now let's turn to the second law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is often called the ADA for short. Now, this law was passed in 1990, and it protects people with disabilities against discrimination in different places. For example, at work, in housing, and in education. By disability, we mean first, any physical or mental condition that limits a person's ability to participate in a major life activity like walking, seeing, or hearing. The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness. It covers both physical and mental disabilities. Let me describe the impact of the ADA. This law has changed life for thousands of disabled people across the country. If you've ridden a public bus in an American city, for example, you know that they all have special mechanisms to help people in wheelchairs get on and off the bus. And doorways have to be wide for the same reason, so that people in wheelchairs can easily get in and out of buildings. In terms of mental disabilities, there's been progress too. Today, some businesses are exploring ways to hire people with mental disabilities if they are capable of doing a particular job, like, well, bagging groceries or greeting customers when they go to a store. And students with learning difficulties can get help, such as extra time on tests. But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think. In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around. And they're also often rejected by society. We need to understand that having a disability doesn't mean people can't participate in society. And people with particular disabilities can do many things to help them lead happy and productive lives. In 1990, when President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law, he said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." In other words, that the wall that had always separated disabled people from everyone else should disappear. Respect is the key here. What this means is that our goal needs to be inclusion, equality, and full participation for all people, including people with disabilities.
Unit 4, American Values. Chapter 7, American Values from the Past. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 128.
Weight and Hope, published in 1877, is by Horatio Alger. In the story, Ben's parents have died. Even though he has only a few friends, he refuses to lose hope. In fact, his motto is, "Wait and hope." His positive spirit impresses a rich stranger, who gives him a job. Ben is also a very good student and wins an academic competition at school. Because of his good luck and determination, Ben is eventually accepted to Harvard University.
Interview 1, Personal Values. Answering true-false questions. Page 133.
Mary Elena, as a mother, what values do you think are particularly important? For example, what values do you try to teach your daughter?
Let's see. I've been thinking a lot about that lately. I'm trying to teach my daughter the importance of independence. I want her to be able to take control of her life.
How old is your daughter?
She just turned 12.
Isn't she a little young to think about being independent?
No, I don't think so. See, I think she faces too much pressure in her life. There's a lot of pressure to do well in school, and my parents have high expectations for the children in my family. They want the children to become professionals, lawyers or architects, that sort of thing. I think all those high expectations put children under too much stress. As my daughter grows up, I want her to realize that she has options.
Some people say that parents should have high expectations of their children. Wouldn't you agree with that?
No, not really. I think there are many ways to be happy and productive. So I think people should have choices. I want my daughter to be good at something that is meaningful for her, something that will make her happy. Maybe she'll become an artist, a painter, a singer, an actress, or a chef. What's important is that she make her own decisions.
What if she can't find a job being an actress or a chef?
Well, she can do something else. I have a friend who's in his late 30s. He was working in a hospital, but he didn't like it. He just went back to college because he decided he wants to be a lawyer. And nobody told him he shouldn't do it. Even though, it is a little bit strange. He's one of the oldest students in the class. And he's sitting there with 18-year-olds. But that's okay. You can change professions, no matter how old you are. After all, He's only in his 30s.
That's interesting. Well, now, Dan, let me ask you the same question. What are some values that are important to you?
Well, the first thing I think of is hard work and self-reliance. These values are everywhere you look. For example, politicians are always talking about the value of personal responsibility.
Is personal responsibility the same as self-reliance?
Yeah, depending on yourself and trying to improve yourself. I don't think you should grow up expecting other people to take care of you. And that is common sense advice, especially in this economic climate.
You've just started college, right?
Yes, and I take college really seriously. That's because I know that if I want to do well, I have to study hard. So I put a lot of effort into my studies. Oh, and I have a part-time job too. I also just started working at a bookstore, and I really like having a job. I mean, obviously, sometimes it's hard to have to go to work instead of watching TV or going out with your friends. But once I get there, I feel like I'm doing something with my life.
Oh, really? You work as well as study?
Yeah, I think that working helps you to prepare for life after college. Having a job helps you to set goals and work toward them. And I also see work as my duty and my obligation. I don't want to keep asking my family for money. I like having my own spending money. That way, I can do whatever I like with it.
Listening for tone of voice. Page 133. Excerpt 1.
I think there are many ways to be happy and productive. So I think people should have choices. I want my daughter to be good at something that is meaningful for her, something that will make her happy.
Excerpt 2.
It is a little bit strange. He's one of the oldest students in the class, and he's sitting there with 18-year-olds. But that's okay. You can change professions, no matter how old you are. After all, he's only in his 30s.
Excerpt 3.
I don't think you should grow up expecting other people to take care of you. And that is common sense advice, especially in this economic climate.
Excerpt 4.
I also just started working at a bookstore, and I really like having a job. I mean, obviously, sometimes it's hard to have to go to work instead of watching TV or going out with your friends. But once I get there, I feel like I'm doing something with my life.
Interview 2. Values in theory and practice. Listening for main ideas. Page 134.
Hello, Pauline. Values. How important are they to you?
Yeah, well, people talk a lot about values, but I think you have to see what happens in practice, in real life.
What do you mean?
Well, everyone says it's important to be independent. And I think independence is an important value, but being independent shouldn't mean that, you go off on your own, you don't need anyone else. It isn't the same as being cold or distant. And I think a lot of people are cold and distant. For example, I've lived in other countries where there is a lot of contact with neighbors, and people hang out on the street and talk about everything that's going on. But where I live, nobody even knows who their neighbors are. There are 8 apartments on my floor, but I've only ever seen 1 or 2 neighbors. We say good morning, maybe even have a nice day, but that's it. People are so unfriendly.
What about other values?
Oh, this is interesting. I was reading the other day that modern society values extroverts more than introverts. And I think that is true. Like at work, everyone is very aggressive, and we're expected to go to team meetings every morning and say what we think. My boss told everyone that they had to be assertive. If you go to a team meeting and don't say anything, then they think you're not making any contributions.
Why do you have a problem with that?
Well, even though I'm not exactly a quiet person, I do like to think before I speak. So sometimes I'll be in a meeting and I don't say anything because I need more time to think things through. That happened to me the other day, and then my boss put me on the spot. He said, "Pauline, don't you have any comments?" And I was pretty embarrassed. I couldn't think of what to say right then and there. I need more time to think sometimes. But that doesn't mean I'm not a team player.
So, you've talked about independence and extroversion. Can you add anything else?
Well, a third thing is informality. Americans are pretty informal, and I am too. Like, when I was in school, we got to call our teachers by their first name. It was never Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so. We called them Dave and Margaret, for example.
So do you agree with being informal?
Yes, I do. But you can take it a bit too far. For example, I went to the opera the other day, and I saw guys wearing jeans. I think that's unbelievable. Americans wear jeans everywhere they go. I think men should wear something more formal if they're going to the opera or out to a nice restaurant. You know, not a hat or a suit, but at least a tie and a jacket. It's a matter of respect. Of course you want to be comfortable, but I do think there's a limit.
Lecture. Harry Peterson. 3 American Folk Heroes. Before the lecture. Listening for key words. Page 138. 1.
Today I'm going to talk about 3 traditional American folk heroes. And by folk heroes, I mean real people or imaginary figures who do extraordinary things or who have extraordinary powers.
2.
So, let's begin with the cowboy. Think about all the places you see cowboys. If you turn on the TV, I guarantee you'll find a cowboy movie on one of the channels. And the image of the cowboy is also seen constantly in advertising and fashion.
3.
An entrepreneur is a person who starts a company, who makes business deals in order to make a profit. We think of entrepreneurs as people who have great ideas and take risks. And the entrepreneur is also a very powerful symbol of American values.
4.
There are all kinds of superheroes. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and so on. And most superheroes have extraordinary powers, even though they are in some ways very human.
Lecture. Part 1. Cowboys and Entrepreneurs. Clarifying your notes. Page 140.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about 3 traditional American folk heroes. And by folk heroes, I mean real people or imaginary figures who do extraordinary things or who have extraordinary powers. The United States, like every country, has many of these traditional folk heroes, but I want to talk about 3 famous ones, and they are the cowboy, the entrepreneur, and the superhero. In this country, we see these 3 images everywhere, in the media, in advertising. They represent some of our most important values, and I think that's why they're so popular. So, let's begin with the cowboy. Think about all the places you see cowboys. If you turn on the TV, I guarantee you'll find a cowboy movie on one of the channels. And the image of the cowboy is also seen constantly in advertising and fashion. In fact, I bet that 90% of the people in this room are probably wearing jeans. Why do you think the cowboy is such a popular image in our culture? Well, let's go back in history about 150 years. During the 19th century, people began moving west in order to make their fortune. Some of these settlers started large cattle ranches and hired cowboys. Over time, the cowboy became a classic American hero. Think about it. The cowboy works alone in difficult weather and dangerous conditions. He is completely self-reliant. He never seems to need money or anything like that. He represents courage, freedom, and independence, qualities that almost all Americans still value today. Okay, so next, let's go on to talk about the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a person who starts a company, who makes business deals in order to make a profit. We think of entrepreneurs as people who have great ideas and take risks. And the entrepreneur is also a very powerful symbol of American values. That's because entrepreneurs represent the idea that if you're smart, if you work hard, and if you have good ideas, you can succeed. This kind of success story has been popular ever since the Horatio Alger stories of the early 20th century. And although many young Americans have never heard of Horatio Alger, they certainly know of Steve Jobs or other successful people who have become American heroes because of their talent, their belief in themselves, and the risks that they take. Now, the last American hero I'd like you to think about is imaginary. I'm talking about the kind of superhero found in comic books, movies, and television. There are all kinds of superheroes. Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and so on. Most superheroes have extraordinary powers, even though they are in some ways very human. Superheroes appeal to our deepest fantasies and desires. They're fast and they're powerful, but they have a strong sense of right and wrong. Superman, for example, is always defending the good guys and punishing the bad guys. Most Americans relate very strongly to the values that the superhero represents, and that's why they're so popular in our culture.
Lecture, Part 2, Questions and Answers. Taking notes on questions and answers. Page 141.
All right, are there any questions?
Professor Peterson, can you explain a little more about entrepreneurs? Are they always very successful?
Well, some of them aren't successful. Others are. But after the Civil War, there was a period of huge industrial expansion in the United States. Thousands of miles of railroads were built, and that made it possible for industries like steel and oil to grow. And since that time, there have been some entrepreneurs who have been very, very successful and become extremely rich. Have you heard of, Andrew Carnegie? He made millions of dollars from his steel factories. Oh, and I bet you've heard of John D. Rockefeller. He made his fortune in oil. Carnegie and Rockefeller were two of our earliest entrepreneur heroes. Another question.
Are there any more modern entrepreneurs that have this hero quality you've been describing?
Sure. A couple people come to mind. In addition to Steve Jobs, the brilliant CEO of Apple, I can think of Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, and Mark Zuckerberg, the internet entrepreneur. The most amazing thing is that these men all exemplify a lot of the values we've already spoken about. They're seen as people who have the personal qualities that guarantee success.
I'm really interested in where these values come from, so can you talk a bit more about Superman? Did the Superman figure come out in the 19th century?
No, the first Superman comic book was written a little later, in the 1930s, and the other superhero characters came after that, one after another after another. Have you seen X-Men or Batman? They come out with one sequel after the other. Movies about superheroes are some of the most profitable movies in history. It seems like Americans never get tired of the superhero image. Incidentally, let's not forget the James Bond films. They're British, of course, but they've been coming out since the 1960s, and they also communicate similar values.
Professor, I have a question. You didn't mention almost any women folk heroes. Why not?
Well, yes, I thought about that. The thing is, there are very few traditional folk heroes who are women. There was a woman named Annie Oakley in the 19th century who was famous for her shooting skills. At a time when most women were wives and mothers, she traveled around and had shooting competitions with men. Also, she gave a lot of the money she made to different charities. And then there's Wonder Woman, as I said before, the comic book superhero. She first appeared in 1941. But most of the traditional folk heroes have been men, although I would hope that's going to change in the future.
Unit 4, American Values. Chapter 8, American Values Today. Getting started. Listening for specific information. Page 146.
I've just been reading this article about Generation Y. That's you, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. That's the same as the millennial generation, right? I was born in 1990, so what does the article say about me?
Well, it says there are about 80 million Generation Ys in America. That's a lot. It's about 20% of the population. Generation Y is about 6 times as big as Generation X, which is the generation that came right before. There are, 79 million baby boomers. So the millennials, or Generation Y, is about the same size as the boomers.
What else does the article say?
It talks about the values of your generation.
Like what?
Well, for example, it says you have a tolerance for diversity. It says Generation Ys are very open and tolerant. And then, now this is interesting, you like speed and constant change. You're the internet generation, so you don't like to wait for things.
That's true. What else?
It says you value independence and social responsibility. Is that true?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we should do what we can to make the world a better place.
Interview 1. Differences in values between parents and children. Drawing inferences. Page 148.
Rosianne, do you think that your own values are very different from the values of your parents?
Oh, yeah, I think they are different. My parents have very traditional values. Like, they wanted me to meet a nice guy, get married when I was about 20, and have kids, so that they could help bring up the grandchildren. But I didn't really want to do that.
What did you want?
Well, I guess I was more adventurous. When I was in my early 20s, I wasn't looking for a husband. I was busy looking for a career. I studied hard, and then I became an accountant. It took me a long time to reach that point. I'm 33 now and just recently got married, so I don't have any kids yet.
What do your parents think about your choices?
Well, even though my values are different from theirs, they accepted my decisions.
Benjamin, how about you?
Well, I think I see eye to eye with my parents on many general values like respect, cooperation, family. But I guess my parents and I disagree about how that works out in practice.
What do you mean?
Well, see, I respect my parents' opinions, but they need to respect my privacy. Look, even though I'm in college now, my mother's always calling me. She's like, "Did you do your homework, honey? Did you have dinner yet?" And my father will call too and ask me, "Did you speak to your professor? Did you choose your courses for next semester?" They call that being a helicopter parent. Perhaps that's a kind of pejorative expression, and I mean to insult my parents. It's just that, well, your parents don't need to keep constantly hovering over you. Helicopter parents keep constantly hovering over you, like they're in a helicopter watching what you do from the air. They won't leave you alone.
Oh, so you don't want them to be so involved?
Well, I like them being involved in my life, but they should leave me alone a little more. They're kind of too involved. And it doesn't stop in college either. They keep giving my older brother advice about his job, and he's in his mid-30s. He's been working for 10 years already.
Oh, I see. Well, thank you, Benjamin. Now, Christine, are your values different from your parents' values?
Well, my parents are more conservative than I am. I'm really open to change, but they aren't. My parents and my whole family all live in the same town, and no one has ever moved away. You know, my parents have never even been out of the country.
Never?
No. In fact, my mom's only been on a plane 3 times.
And have you been out of the country?
Well, yeah. I mean, I've already traveled to lots of different places, and I lived abroad for a while. I think it's really important to travel because traveling makes you more open-minded. I like meeting new people. I don't know, experimenting with new things. I like having that kind of freedom.
And what about your friends? Do most of them feel the same way?
Yeah, most of my friends feel the same way. They don't live in the same places as their parents. They move around because they're exploring and trying to see how they can improve their lives.
Listening for stressed words. Page 149. Excerpt 1.
When I was in my early 20s, I wasn't looking for a husband. I was busy looking for a career.
Excerpt 2.
I respect my parents' opinions, but they need to respect my privacy.
Excerpt 3.
I'm really open to change, but they aren't.
Interview 2. Values in the workplace. Listening for specific information. Page 150.
Hi, Sandra. I wanted to interview you because I know you have strong opinions about the values young people need in the workplace.
This is true. I'm a business professor, and I'm always giving advice to my students about the kind of values they have to develop in order to succeed. I ask my students, if you had your own business, would you hire you?
What values do you think they need?
Well, the first thing they need to learn is the value of time. You know what they say, time is money. I find that sometimes students don't respect deadlines. They think, well, I don't have to submit my paper on time. It doesn't matter if it's a day or two late. Or they arrive for class 5 minutes after it starts. But they have to learn that that is not acceptable. So I give them an example. Suppose you want to buy a car, and the dealer tells you that the car will be ready Friday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And you go to the dealer, and everything is all paid for. You've paid your deposit and so on. But the dealer tells you, well, no, I'm sorry. You won't be able to get your car until next Friday. What is your reaction? You're going to be really upset.
Of course, I can see that. Time is money. What other values are important?
Well, after time, the second value is cooperation, working as a team. And this is a very difficult value for a lot of my students to learn. They want to be individuals. They want to work alone and show what they can do. They want to stand out. But that is not what we do in the workplace. You don't work in isolation.
But don't you think individual effort is important?
Yes, of course, it's always important to do your best. But I'd say cooperation is even more important.
And what else?
Well, the third value is professionalism. What I mean is, have a professional attitude. You should dress, speak, and write in an appropriate way, depending on the situation. See, I believe you should behave professionally at work. And when you speak or write, you should be careful to use a formal tone, especially with customers.
Lecture. Jason LaRose. Conservative and Liberal Values in American Politics. Before the lecture. Listening for general statements. Page 156. 1.
But even though people's values are very diverse, the strongest voices in American politics today do generally fall into two groups, conservative and liberal.
2.
Conservatives usually put a strong emphasis on personal responsibility.
3.
Most liberals, on the other hand, think the government should be very active in fixing social problems like poverty and illness.
4.
Generally, conservatives think government is too big and expensive.
5.
conservatives typically believe the government should stay out of the way of business.
6.
But in general, liberals believe that government should control and regulate business through strict laws or taxes.
Lecture, Part 1. Conservative and Liberal Values. Taking notes in a point-by-point format. Page 157.
Good morning, everyone. The focus today will be conservative and liberal values in American politics. Of course, you have to understand that I can only talk about these things in a general way today, because this is a very broad topic. It's very hard to make specific statements about Americans' political beliefs since there are more than 300 million Americans from so many different racial, religious, and economic backgrounds. But even though people's values are very diverse, the strongest voices in American politics today do generally fall into two groups, conservative and liberal. So let me outline for you some of the basic differences between conservatives and liberals in three areas: the role of government, taxes, and government regulation of business. Let's begin with the role of government. Conservatives usually put a strong emphasis on personal responsibility. They think that people should be responsible for themselves. In other words, they don't believe it's the government's responsibility to pay for social programs that guarantee things like a minimum wage or health insurance. Most liberals, on the other hand, think the government should be very active in fixing social problems like poverty and illness. Liberals believe it's the responsibility of the government to provide money and help for people who are poor or sick. So, for example, they typically support laws that guarantee workers a minimum wage or free lunches at school for poor children. Now, let's move to the second difference I wanted to mention. Generally, conservatives think government is too big and expensive. A big government requires citizens to pay high taxes to support its programs. And high taxes are not popular with conservatives, especially during economic recessions. Conservatives are in favor of cutting taxes for the rich as a way of stimulating job creation and economic growth. But liberals believe taxes are necessary because they help government provide the services we need for an equal and productive society. Taxes are important because they give government money to support social programs like the ones I mentioned before, okay? Finally, conservatives typically believe the government should stay out of the way of business, that it shouldn't interfere too much in the way business works. They think that an economy with less government control is the best way for the economy to grow and to provide jobs. But in general, liberals believe that government should control and regulate business through strict laws or taxes. Because if it doesn't, they think entrepreneurs won't care about their workers, their customers, or the environment. They'll only care about their own profits. So, many liberals think business should be closely regulated, and they favor establishing government programs as a way of stimulating employment opportunities during economic recessions.
Lecture, Part 2. Values and Political Parties. Using information on the board to help you take notes. Page 159.
Let me remind you that the U.S. has two main political parties. So in an election, voters generally choose between the Republicans and the Democrats. And in general, I think most people associate the Republican Party with conservative values and ideas, and the Democratic Party with liberal ones. But people's values can change over time. And we can see this clearly if we look at the results of the presidential elections of 1964, 1980, 2000, and 2008. Can you all see the board? What you'll notice immediately is that there has been a noticeable change in the voting patterns over the past 40-something years. In 1964, a majority of votes, about 61%, were for the Democratic candidate for president, Lyndon Johnson. 16 years later, in 1980, more than 50% of the votes went to the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan. Reagan won by nearly 60% when he ran for a second term 4 years later. In 2000, the voters were more equally divided. In fact, the country was split down the middle. About half voted for Republican candidate George W. Bush and half for the Democratic candidate Al Gore. In the end, the Republicans won that year, but the results were very, very close. Then, in 2008, the Democratic Party again won the national elections with 53% of the vote. The situation in 2012 was similar. In that election, Barack Obama won his re-election campaign, but only by the slimmest of margins. Why do changes like these happen? How do we explain them? Well, sometimes changes in voting patterns are the result of economic conditions, meaning, for example, that voters are responding to high employment or unemployment rates. A strong economy helped Ronald Reagan get elected for a second term in 1984, for example. Or there could be other reasons, such as concern about the international situation. The attack of September 11th, 2001 was probably a factor in George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. But obviously, a third reason for changing voting patterns is that a new generation of voters have different values from the generation that came before them. Millennials don't necessarily vote the same way as their parents, the baby boomers. And people's values often change as they get older, and they tend to become more conservative. On the other hand, as more young people participate in elections, the strength of the Democratic Party tends to increase. This was evident in 2008 in the election of Barack Obama. I want to emphasize that I've been discussing American political values and the political system in a very general way. In practice, many Americans are not strict conservatives or liberals. They may have conservative beliefs on some issues and liberal ideas on others. And all Democrats and Republicans are not the same either. You know, often we see our country divided on the map between red and blue states. But in my opinion, all 50 states are actually different shades of purple because there are both conservative and liberal voters in every state in the nation.